Section 4 of The Man of Genius by Cesare Lombroso. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 4. Genius and Insanity. Resemblance between genius and insanity. Men and women of genius who have been insane. Montanus, Harrington, Haller, Schumann, Gerard de Nerval, Baudelaire, Concato, Manlander, Comte, Codazzi, Bollier, Cardan, Tasso, Swift, Newton, Russell, Linnau, Zetchenyi, Hoffmann, Fodera, Schopenhauer, Gogol. The resemblance between insanity and genius, although it does not show that these two should be confounded, proves at all events that one does not exclude the other in the same subject. In fact, without speaking of the numerous men of genius who at some period of their lives were subject to hallucinations or insanity, or of those who, like Vico, terminated a great career in dementia, how many great thinkers have shown themselves all their lives subject to monomania or hallucinations. In recent times, insanity has shown itself in Farini, Brougham, Southey, Gavone, Gounod, Gutzkow, Monge, Faircroy, Cowper, Roccia, Ricci, Phoenicia, Engel, Pericles, Batjaskov, Murger, William Collins, Techner, Holderlin, von der West, Gallo, Spedalleri, Bellingeri, Salieri, Johannes Muller, Lenz, Barbera, Fuseli, Petermann, the caricaturist Cham, Hamilton, Poe, Ulrich. In France, remarks Martini, many young and original poets have died insane. Such also seems to have been the fate of Briffault and of Laurent, attacked by a veritable mania of calumny. Among women, Gunderode, Stieglitz, who both committed suicide with great deliberation, Brockman, Aeoli Landon lived and died insane. Montanus, a victim to solitude and disordered imagination, was convinced that he had become a grain of wheat. He refused to move for fear of being swallowed by birds. Harrington is said to have imagined that diseases took the form of bees and flies, and for this reason he retired to a cabin armed with a broom to disperse them. Haller believed that he was persecuted by men and damned by God on account of the vileness of his soul and his heretical works. He could only soothe his excessive terror by enormous doses of opium and by converse with priests. Ampere burned a treatise on the future of chemistry, believing he had written it by satanic suggestion. Great Dutch artist Van Gogh thought he was possessed. Carlo Dos, a prey to religious monomania, vowed only to paint religious pictures. He devoted his pencil to Madonnas, though his Madonna, indeed, is a portrait of Balduini. On his wedding day he alone was missing. After some hours he was found prostrated before the altar of the Annunciation. Nathaniel Lee, the dramatist, composed 13 tragedies during the course of his disease. One day, a feeble dramatic colleague told him that it was easy to write like a madman. "It is not easy to write like a madman," he replied, "but it is very easy to write like a fool." Thomas Lloyd, who wrote excellent verse, was a strange mixture of malice, pride, genius, and insanity. If he was not satisfied with his verses, he put them in his glass to polish them. As he said, everything that he came across, even coal, paper, and tobacco, he was accustomed to mix with his food for hygienic reasons. The carbon purified it. Stone imparted mineral virtues, etc. Charles Lamb, in early life, had an attack of insanity, which was hereditary in his family. Writing of this to Coleridge, he said, "At some future time I will amuse you with an account, as full as my memory will permit, of the strange turns my frenzy took. I look back upon it at the times with a gloomy kind of envy, for, while it lasted, I had many, many hours of pure happiness. Dream not, Coleridge, of having tasted all the grandeur and wildness of fancy to have gone mad. All now seems to me vapid, or comparatively so." Robert Schumann, 1810 to 1856, the precursor of the music of the future, was the youngest son of a well-to-do bookseller in Zwickau, and met with no obstacles in the purest of his cherished art. When a law student he met Clara Wieck, the celebrated pianist, and in her found an excellent and lovable companion. But at the age of 23 he became subject to melancholia. At 46 he was pursued by her turning tables, which knew everything. He heard sounds which developed into concords and even whole compositions. For several years he was afraid of being sent to a lunatic asylum. Beethoven and Mendelssohn dictated musical combinations to him from their tombs. In 1854 he threw himself into the Rhine. He was saved and died 2 years later in a private asylum at Bonn. The autopsy revealed osteophytes, thickening of the cranial membranes, and atrophy of the brain. Gerard de Nerval was subject to folie circulaire, with alternate periods of exaltation and depression, each which lasted 6 months. In these moments of calm he was a spiritualist. He heard the spirits of Adam, Moses, and Joshua in a piece of furniture, and practiced Kabbalistic exorcisms, executing the dance of the Babylonians. During his stay in an asylum, he imagined that it was the superintendent who was a victim of insanity. He believes, he says, that he is superintending an asylum, but is himself the madman, and we feign madness in order to humour him. With the honey of flowers he traced on paper symbols which radiated round a fantastic giantess who united the characters Diana, Saint Rosalie, and of an actress named Colon, with whom he believed he was in love. In reality he adored her from a great distance, sending her large bouquets and buying enormous opera glasses in order to see her, and superb canes with which to applaud her, so that it was said of him that he ruined himself in orgies of opera glasses and debaucheries of canes. He had discovered a medieval bed which was to serve for his amours, and in order to set it in suitable surroundings he obtained an apartment and luxurious furniture. In days of poverty the furniture was sold, leaving the bed alone in the room, then in a barn, and at last it also disappeared, and its proprietor passed his nights in taverns and low lodging houses, or writing beneath trees and porches. Later, when he had ceased to see Colon, she became for him a kind of idol with which he lived, and who in his mystic ideas became confounded partly with the saints and partly with the stars. One day he declared that she was an incarnation of Saint Teresa. When he heard that she had declared she had never loved him and only seen him once, which was true, he said, "What good if she had loved me?" And he added, quoting a verse of Heine, "He who loves for the second time without hope is a madman. I am that madman. The sky, the sun, the stars laugh at it. I also laugh at it and die of it." One day at sunset, he was on the balcony of a house. He suddenly saw a phantom and heard a voice calling him. He ran forward, fell, and was nearly killed. That was his first attack, characterized by hallucinations of sight and hearing. Towards the end of his life, at the age of 46, folie des grandeurs developed in him. He spoke of his chateau at Ermenonville, of his physical beauty, which was astonishing. He said to his attendants, he brought up coins of Nerva, not wishing that the name of his ancestors should circulate as money. Yet Nerval was only a pseudonym. Sometimes he gave out that he was a descendant of Folabello di Nerva, whose history he wished to write, and all whose male descendants presented, according to him, a supernatural sign, the tetragramma of Solomon, on their breasts. Timid and cautious in his days of calm, he became bold and noisy when the attack came on, and even threatened his friends with weapons. In spite of the low temperature, he refused to leave off his summer clothes. Cold, he declared, is a tonic, and the lapse are never ill. A few days after, he hanged himself. Baudelaire appears before us in the portrait placed at the beginning of his posthumous works, as a type of the lunatic possessed by the délire des grandeurs. Portrait of Baudelaire is displayed on the page. He was descended from a family of insane and eccentric persons. It was not necessary to be an alienist to detect his insanity. In childhood he was subject to hallucinations, and from that period, as he himself confessed, he experienced opposing sentiments. The horror and the ecstasy of life, he was hyper-aesthetic and at the same time apathetic. He felt the necessity of freeing himself from an oasis of horror in a desert of ennui. Before falling into dementia, he committed impulsive acts. For instance, he threw pots from his house against shop windows for the pleasure of hearing them break. He changed his lodgings every month, asked the hospitality of a friend in order to complete work he was engaged on, and wasted his time in reading, which had no relation to it whatever. Having lost his father, he quarrelled with his mother's second husband, and one day, in the presence of friends, attempted to strangle him. Sent out to India in order, it said, to be put to business, he lost everything and only brought back from his voyage a negress to whom he dedicated exotic poems. He desired to be original at all costs, gave himself to excess in wine before hired personages, dyed his hair green, wore winter garments in summer, and vice versa. He experienced morbid passions in love. He loved ugly and horrible women, negresses, dwarfs, giantesses. To be a beautiful woman, he expressed a desire that he might see her suspended by the hands to the ceiling, that he might kiss her feet, and kissing the naked foot appears in one of his poems as the equivalent of the sexual act. He was constantly dreaming of work, calculating the hours and the lines necessary to pay his debts, 2 months or more. But that was all, and the work was never begun. Proud, misanthropic, and apathetic, he said of himself, "Discontented with others and discontented with myself, I desire to redeem myself, to regard myself with little pride in the silence and solitude of the night. Souls of those I have loved, souls of those I have sung, strengthen me, sustain me. Remove me the lines and corrupting vapours of the world, and thou, O Lord my God, grant me grace to produce some fine lines which will prove to myself that I am not the last of men, that I am not inferior to those whom I contemn." And he had need of it, for he called Gustave Planche imbecile, Dumas a farceur, Sue stupid, Feval an idiot, George Sand a voilot without delicacy. What he attacked in all these writers was the fame he wished to possess. That is why he made fun of Molière and Voltaire. With the progress of insanity he used to invert words, saying "shut" what he meant to say open, etc. He died of progressive general paralysis of the insane, of which his excessive ambition was already a forerunning symptom. Concato was the son of a poor tailor, the victim of grave cerebral affections. He himself presented certain characters of degeneration, such as pallor and large cheekbones. During many years he was subject to various forms of insanity. At the age of 17 he was seized by the terror of sudden death, and provided himself with nitre to prevent further cerebral crisis. At 20 he resolved to become a monk, although in childhood he had been so little devout that he had fabricated false notes of confession. Afterwards he quarrelled with an Austrian officer, and then became afraid of all sentinels and soldiers. He would never allow an officer to enter his house with his sword by his side, and even in old age trembled at the sight of one of the city guards. One night he dreamt he had committed a homicide, and for many days he was a prey to strange terrors. He suffered from claustrophobia, rode to whomsoever tried to lock him up in a carriage or a room. There were some days during which he considered himself the lowest of men. He was so irascible that he used to say that, to be in good health, one must be angry at least once a day. Yet he was one of the greatest of European physicians. Mainlander had a grandfather who, after the death of a son, carried religious mysticism to the extent of insanity and died of inflammation of the brain at the age of 33. A brother, also insane, wished to embrace Buddhism. As a youth, looking at the sea at Sorrento, he felt impelled to throw himself in, merely attracted by the purity of the water. He educated himself and wrote his celebrated book, De Philosophie de Erlösung. But to realize his theories entirely, he adopted the rule of absolute chastity, and on the day on which his book was published hanged himself, the better to confirm a passage which said, "In order that man may be redeemed, it is necessary that he should recognize the value of not being, and desire intensely not to be." The great Auguste Comte, the imitator of the positivist philosophy, was for 10 years under the care of Esquirol, the famous alienist. He recovered, but only to repudiate, without any cause, the wife who had saved him. Later he, who had wished to abolish all priestcraft, believed himself the priest and apostle of a materialistic religion. In his works, amidst stupendous elucubrations, generally maniacal ideas may be found, as for example the prophecy that one day women will be fecundated without the help of the male. It is said that mathematicians are exempt from physical derangements, but this is not true. It is sufficient to recall not only Newton and Nephentin, of whom I will speak at length, but the two famous distractions of Archimedes, the hallucination of Pascal, and the vagaries of the mathematician Codazzi, not to be confounded with Codazza. Codazzi was submicrocephalic, oxycephalic, alcoholic, sordidly avaricious, and effective insensibly. He added vanity so great that while still young he set apart a sum for his own funeral monument, and refused the least help to his starving parents. He admitted no discussion of his judgment, even if it only concerned the cut of a coat, and he had taken it into his head that he could compose melodic music with the help of the calculus. All mathematicians admire the great geometer Bolyai, whose eccentricities were of an insane character. Thus he provoked 13 officials to duels and fought with them, and between each duel he played the violin, the only piece of furniture in his house. When pensioned, he printed his own funeral card with a blank date and constructed his own coffin, a vagary which I found in 2 other mathematicians who died in recent years. 6 years later he had a similar funeral card printed to substitute it for the other which he had not been able to use. He imposed on his hire the obligation to plant on his grave an apple tree, in remembrance of Eve, of Paris, and of Newton. Such was the great reformer of Euclid. Cardan, called by his contemporaries the greatest of men and the most foolish of children. Cardan, who first dared to criticize Galen, to exclude fire from the number of the elements, and to call witches and saints insane. This great Cardan was the son, cousin, and father of lunatics, and himself a lunatic all his life. A stammerer, impotent with little memory or knowledge, he himself wrote, "I have suffered since childhood from hypnophantastic hallucinations. Sometimes it was a cock which spoke to him in a human voice, sometimes Tartarus, full of bones, which displayed itself before him. Whatever he imagined, he could see before him as a real object. From the age of 19 to that of 26, a genius, similar to one which already protected his father, gave him advice and revealed the future. When he reached the age of 26, he was not altogether deprived of supernatural aid. A receipt which was not quite right forgot one day the laws of gravity, and rose to his table to warn him of the error he was about to commit. He was hypochondriacal, and imagined he had contracted all the diseases that he had read of: palpitation, schizophobia, diarrhea, enuresis, podagra, hernia. All these diseases vanished without treatment, or with a prayer to the Virgin. Sometimes his flesh smelt of sulphur, of extinguished wax. Sometimes he saw flames and phantoms appear in the midst of violent earthquakes, while his friends perceived nothing. Persecuted by every government, surrounded by a forest of enemies, whom he knew neither by name nor by sight, but who, as he believed, in order to afflict and dishonor him, had condemned his much-loved son, he ended by believing himself poisoned by the professors of the University of Pavia, who had invited him for this purpose. If he escaped from their hands, he owes it to the help of St. Martin and of the Virgin. Yet such a man in theology had audaciously anticipated Dupuis and Renan. He declares himself inclined to all vices: wine, gaming, lying, licentiousness, envy, cunning, deception, calumny, inconstancy. He observes that 4 times during the full moon he found himself in a state of real mental alienation. His sensibility was so perverted that he neither felt comfortable except under the stimulus of some physical pain, and in the absence of natural pain he procured it by artificial means, binding his lips or arms until he fetched blood. I sought causes of pain to enjoy the pleasure of the cessation of pain, and because I perceived that when I did not suffer I fell into so grave and troublesome a condition that it was worse than any pain. This fact helps us to understand many strange tortures which madmen have voluptuously imposed on themselves. He had so blind a faith in the revelations of dreams that he printed a strange work, De Somnis, conducted his mental consultations, concluded his marriage, and begun his works. For example, that on the Varieta della Cos and sul Febri, in accordance with dreams. He was impotent up to the age of 34. Virility was given to him in a dream, and to this gift was added, not altogether happily, the cause of his troubles. His future wife, a brigand's daughter, whom before this dream, as he asserts, he had never even seen. His unhappy mania even led him to regulate his medical consultations according to his dreams, as he himself boasts of doing in the case of Borrimo's son. It is possible to cite other examples, sometimes comic, sometimes strange or terrible. I will quote one which unites all these characters: his dream of the jewel. It was May 1560, when Cardan was 52 years of age. His son had just been publicly condemned for poisoning. No misfortune could wound more deeply Cardan's already sensitive soul. He loved his son with all a father's tenderness, as is witnessed by his fine verses, De Morte Filii, in which there is an imprint of real passion. He hoped also for a grandson who should resemble himself. Drawn more and more into insane ideas by grief, he saw in this condemnation the hands of persecutors. Thus overwhelmed, I sought distraction in vain in study or in play. In vain I bit myself and struck my arms and legs. It was my 3rd night of sleeplessness. About 2 hours before dawn, I saw that there was nothing else for me but to die or go mad. Therefore I prayed God to snatch me entirely away from life. Then again my expectation. Sleep took possession of me, and, At the same time, I heard a person approaching me, whose form I could not see, but who said, "Why grieve about your son? Put into your mouth the precious stone which you bear suspended from your neck. As long as you carry it there, you will not think of your son." On waking up, I asked myself what connection there could be between forgetfulness and an emerald. But as I had no other resource, I recalled the sacred words, "Creditit et reputatiam est ad Justiniam." I put the emerald into my mouth, and then, against all expectation, everything that recalled my son vanished from my memory. It was so for a year and a half. It was only during my meals and at my public lectures, when I was unable to keep the precious stone in my mouth, that I fell back into my old grief. This singular cure had its pretext in the double sense of the Italian word gioia, which means at once joy and jewel. Cardan had, however, no need of the revelation of a genius. For his own words, he had already recognized a consoling virtue in precious stones due to the bond of this absurd etymology. A megalomaniac, he called himself, the seventh physician since the creation of the world. He claimed to know the things which are before and above us, and those which shall come after. Like Rousseau and like Huller, Cardan, during the last days of tormented existence, wrote his own life. He also foretold the exact date of his death, which he looked for, and perhaps himself brought about, in order that his horoscope should not be made to lie. What shall we say of Tasso? For those who do not know Verger's monograph, L'Epimania del Tasso, it will be enough to quote the following letter. "So great is my grief that I am considered by others and by myself as mad. When powerless to keep my sorrowful thoughts hidden, I give myself up to long conversations with myself. My troubles are at once human and diabolical. The human are cries of men, and especially women, and also the laughter of beasts. The diabolical are songs, etc. When I take into my hands a book to give myself up to study, I hear voices sounding in my ear, and distinguish the name Paul Fulvius. It is Messagerio, which became, with him, later on, a real hallucination. He had already made the often repeated confession of his madness, and he attributed to wine and to women. I am thus inclined to believe that he had described himself in the character of Drusus, in that admirable stanza of the Aminta, which another monomaniac, Rousseau, loved so much. Vivo fra I me tormenti e fra la cure. My gusti furi forsenato errante. Peventero lo ombre solengi e secur. Che il primo ero mi recenano avante. E del solici scopri le mei sventre. E scivo et in horror avro it sembiante. Temero me medesmo, e da me stesso. Sempre fugendo, avro me sempre appresso. One day, certainly under the influence of some hallucination, or in a maniacal attack, he drew a knife and was about to attack a serving man who entered the ducal chamber. He was imprisoned, says the Tuscan ambassador, more to cure him than to punish him. The unfortunate poet went from one country to another, but sorrowful visions everywhere threatened him, and with them came ceaseless remorse, suspicion of poison, and the terrors of hell for the heresies of which he accused himself in 3 letters to the too indulgent inquisitor. I am always troubled by sad and wearisome thoughts, he confesses to the physician Cavallaro, by figures and phantoms, also by great weakness of memory. Therefore I beg of your lordship to think to strengthen my memory in the pills you order for me. I am frenzied, he wrote to Gonzaga. I am surprised that they have not written to you of all the things that I say in talking to myself. Honours, the good graces of emperors and kings which I dream of forming and reforming them according to my fancy. This curious letter shows us how sombre and sorrowful images alternated in him with others that were joyous, like subjective colours in the retina. Some days later he wrote to Cattaneo, I fear much more need of the exorcist than of the physician, for my trouble is caused by magic art. I will tell you about my goblin. The little thief hath robbed me of many crowns. He puts all my books upside down, opens my chests, hides my keys, so that I don't know how to protect myself against him. I am always unhappy, but especially at night. I do not know if my trouble should be attributed to frenzy. In another letter, when I am awake, I seem to see lights sparkling in the air. Sometimes my eyes are inflamed, so that I fear I may lose my sight. Other times I hear horrible noises, hissings, tinklings, the sound of bells, and as it were, clocks all striking the hour at the same time. When I am asleep, I seem to see a horseman throwing himself on me and casting me to the earth, or else I imagine that I am covered by filthy beasts. All my joints feel it. My head becomes heavy, and in the midst of so many pains and terrors, sometimes there appears to me the image of the Virgin, beautiful and young, with her son, and crowned with a rainbow. Later he told Cattaneo how a goblin carried away letters in which he was mentioned, and that is one of the miracles which I saw myself at the hospital. Thus I possess the certainty that these wonders must be attributed to a magician. I have numerous proofs of it. One day a loaf was taken from me beneath my eyes towards 3 o'clock. When ill with acute fever, he was cured, thanks to an apparition of the Virgin, to whom he testified his gratitude in a sonnet. He wrote and spoke to, almost touched his genius, who often resembled his former messaggero, and suggested to him ideas which he had not conceived before. Swift, the inventor of irony and humour, predicted even in youth that he would die insane, and it had been the case with a paternal uncle. He was walking one day in the garden when he saw an elm almost completely deprived of foliage at the top. "Like that tree," he said, "I shall die at the top." Proud almost to monomania with the great, he yet led a wild and vicious life, and was known as the Mad Parson. Though a clergyman, he wrote irreligious books, and it was said that before making him a bishop it would be desirable to baptize him. His giddiness began, as he himself tells us, at the age of 23, so his brain disease lasted for over 50 years. Vertiginosus, inops, surdus, malgratus amicus, as he defined himself. He almost succumbed to the grief caused by the death of his beloved Stella, and at the same time he wrote his burlesque directions to servants. Some months later he lost his memory and only preserved his mordant loquacity. He remained for a whole year without speaking or reading or recognizing anyone. He would walk for 10 hours a day, eating his meals standing or refusing food, and giving way to attacks of rage when anyone entered his room. With the development of some boils, his condition seemed to improve. He was heard to say several times, "I am a fool." But the interval of lucidity was short. He fell back into the stupor of dementia, although his irony seemed to survive reason, and even as it were life itself. He died in 1745 in a state of complete dementia, leaving by a will, made some years previously, a sum of nearly £11,000 to a lunatic asylum. A post-mortem examination showed softening of the brain and extreme effusion. His skull, examined in 1855, showed great irregularities from thickening and roughening, signs of enlarged and diseased arteries and an extremely small cerebral region. In an epitaph which he had written for himself, he summed up the cruel tortures of his soul now at rest. Ubi saeva indignatio ulterius cor lacerare nequit. Newton, of whom it was truly said that his mind conquered the human race, was in old age afflicted by mental disorder, though of a less serious character than that of which we have just read. It was probably during this illness that he wrote his Chronology, his Apocalypse, and the Letters to Bentley, so inferior in value to the work of his earlier years. In 1693, after his house had been burnt a second time, and after excess in study, he is reported to have talked so strangely and incoherently to the Archbishop that his friends were seriously alarmed. At this time he wrote 2 letters which, in their confused and obscure form, seemed to show that he had been suffering from delusions of persecution. He wrote to Locke, 1693, "Being of opinion that you endeavour to embroil me with women, and by other means, I was so much affected with it, as that when one told me you were sickly and would not live, I answered, 'Twere better if you were dead. I desire you to forgive me this uncharitableness, for I am now satisfied that what you have done is just, though I beg your pardon for my having hard thoughts of you for it, and for representing that you stuck at the root of morality, in a principle you laid in your book of ideas, and designed to pursue in another book, and that I took you for a hobbyist. I beg your pardon also for saying or thinking that there was a design to sell me an office or to embroil me. I am your most humble and unfortunate servant, is Newton." Locke replied kindly, and a month later Newton again wrote to him, "The last winter, by sleeping too often by my fire, I got an ill habit of sleeping, and a distemper, which this summer has been epidemical, put me further out of order, so that when I wrote to you I had not slept an hour a night for a fortnight together, and for 5 days together not a wink. I remember I wrote to you, but what I said of your book I remember not. And in a letter to Pepys, he says that he has neither ate nor slept this 12-month, nor have my former constancy of mind. Those who, without frequenting a lunatic asylum, wish to form a fairly complete idea of the mental tortures of a monomaniac have only to look through Rousseau's works, especially his letter writings such as the Confessions, the Dialogues, and the Reveries. I have very ardent passions, he writes in his Confessions, and while under their influence my impetuosity knows no bounds. I think only the object which occupies me. The entire universe besides is nothing to me, but this only lasts a moment, and the moment which follows throws me into a state of prostration. A single sheet of fine paper tempts me more than the money to buy a ream of it. I see the thing and am tempted. If I only see the means of acquiring it, I am not tempted. Even now, if I see anything that tempts me, I prefer taking it to asking for it. This is the distinction between the kleptomaniac and the thief. The former steals by instinct to steal, the latter steals by interest to acquire. The first is led away by anything that strikes him, the second is attracted by the value of the object. Dominated by his senses, Rousseau never knew how to resist them. The most insignificant pleasure, he says, as long as it was present, fascinated him more than all the joys of paradise. In fact, a monk's dinner, Father Pontier, led him to apostasy, and a feeling of repulsion caused him to abandon cruelly an epileptic friend on the road. It was not only his passions that were morbid and violent. His intelligence also was affected from his earliest days, as he shows in his Confessions. My imagination has never been so cheerful as when I have been suffering. My mind cannot beautify the really pleasant things that happen to me, only the imaginary ones. If I wish to describe spring well, it must be in winter. Real evils had little hold on Rousseau, it tells us. Imaginary evils touched him more nearly. I can adapt myself to what I experience, but not to what I fear. It is thus that people kill themselves through fear of death. On first reading medical books, Rousseau imagined that he had the diseases which he found described, and was astonished not to find himself healthy, but to find himself alive. He came to the conclusion that he had a polypus of the heart. It was, as he himself confesses, a strange notion, the overflow of an idle and exaggerated sensibility which had no better channel. There are times, he says, in which I am so little like myself that I may be taken for a man of quite different character. In repose I am indolence and timidity itself, and do not know how to express myself, but if I became excited I immediately know what to say. This unfortunate man went through a long series of occupations, from the noblest to the most degrading. He was an apostate for money, a watchmaker, a charlatan, a music master, an engraver, a painter, a servant, an embryo diplomatic secretary. In literature and science he took up medicine, music, botany, theology, teaching. The abuse of intellectual work, especially dangerous in a thinker whose ideas were developed slowly and with difficulty, joined to the ever-increasing stimulus of ambition, gradually transformed a hypochondriac into a melanchondriac, and finally into a maniac. My agitations and anger, he wrote, affected me so much that I passed 10 years in delirium, and am only calm today. Calm when disease now became chronic no longer permitted him to distinguish what was real, what was imaginary in his troubles. In fact, he bade farewell to the world of society, in which he had never felt at home, and retired into solitude. But even in the country, people from the town zealously pursued him, and the tumult of the world and notions of amour propre veiled the freshness of nature. It is in vain for him to hide himself in the woods. He writes in his Reveries, the crowd attaches itself to him and follows him. We think once more of Tasso's lines. Ida mi stesso, sempre fugendo, avrò me sempre appresso. Rousseau doubtless alluded to these lines when he wrote to Corancas that Tasso had been his prophet. He wrote later that he believed that Prussia, England, France, the king, women, priests, men, irritated by some passages in his works, were waging a terrible war against him, the effects by which he explained the internal troubles from which he suffered. In the refinement of their cruelty, he says in the Reveries, his enemies only forgot one thing, to graduate their torments, so they could always renew them. But the chief artifice of his enemies was to torture him by overwhelming him with benefits and with praise. They even went so far as to corrupt the greengrocers, so that they sold him better and cheaper vegetables. Without doubt his enemies thus wished to prove his baseness and their generosity. During his stay in London, his melancholia was changed into a real attack of mania. He imagined that Choiseul was seeking to arrest him, abandoned his luggage and his money at his hotel, and fled to the coast, paying the innkeepers with pieces of silver spoons. He found the winds contrary, and in this saw another indication of the plot against him. In his exasperation, he harangued the crowd in bad English from the top of a hill. They listened stupefied, and he believed he had affected them. But on returning to France, his invisible enemies were not appeased. They spied and misinterpreted all his acts. If he read a newspaper, they said he was conspiring. If he smelled the perfume of a rose, they suspected he was concocting a poison. Everything was a crime. They stationed a picture dealer at his door. They prevented the door from shutting. No visitor came whom they had not prejudiced against him. They corrupted his coffee merchant, his hairdresser, his landlord. The shoeblack had no more blacking when Rousseau needed him. The boatman had no boats when this unfortunate man wished to cross the Seine. He demanded to be put in prison, and even that was refused him. In order to take from him the one weapon which he possessed, the press, a publisher whom he did not know, was arrested and thrown into the Bastille. The custom of burning a cardboard figure at the Mare Carême had been abolished. It is re-established, solely to make fun of him and to burn an effigy. In fact, the clothes placed on it resembled his. In the country, he meets a child who smiles at him. He turns to respond, and suddenly sees a man whom, by his mournful face, note the method of recognition, he sees to be a spy placed by his enemies. Under the constant impression of this monomania of persecution, he wrote his Dialogue sur Rousseau, jugé par Rousseau, in which, in order to appease his innumerable enemies, he presented a faithful and minute portrait of his hallucinations. He began to distribute his defense, in a truly insane manner, by presenting a copy to any passer-by whose face did not appear prejudiced against him by his enemies. It was dedicated à tous les Français aimant encore la justice et la vérité. In spite of the title, or perhaps because of it, it found no one who would accept it with pleasure. Several even refused it. No longer able to put trust in an immortal, he turned, like Pascal to God, to whom he addressed a very tender and familiar letter. Then, in order to ensure the arrival of his letter at its destination, he placed it together with the manuscript of the dialogues on the altar of Notre Dame at Paris. Then, having found the railing closed, he suspected a conspiracy of heaven against him. Dusaux, who saw him often in the last years of his life, writes that he even distrusted his dog, finding a mystery in his frequent caresses. The délire des grandeurs was never absent. It may be seen continually in the Confessions, in which he defies the human race to show a better being than himself. After all this testimony, it does not seem to me that Voltaire and Courrances were altogether wrong in affirming that Rousseau had been mad, and that he confessed it himself. Numerous passages in the Confessions and in Grimm's letters allude to other affections such as paralysis of the bladder and spermatoria, which probably originated in the spinal cord, and which certainly aggravated his melancholia. It must also be remembered that from childhood, Rousseau, like so many other subjects of degeneration, showed sexual precocity and perversion. It appears that he has no pleasure in his relations with women unless they beat him naked, like a child, or threaten to do so. Nicholas Linnell, one of the greatest lyric poets of modern times, ended 40 years ago in the asylum of Döbling at Vienna, a life from which childhood shows a mingling of genius and insanity. He was born in 1802 in Hungary, the son of a proud and vicious aristocrat, and of a melancholy, sensitive, and ascetic mother. At an early age he manifested tendencies to sadness, to music, and to mysticism. He studied medicine, law, agriculture, and especially music. In 1831, when Kerner remarked in him strange fits of sadness and melancholy, and noticed that at other times he would spend whole nights in the garden playing his favourite violin. "I feel myself," he wrote to his sister, "gravitating towards misfortune. The demon of insanity rides in my heart. I am mad. To you, sister, I say it, for you will love me all the same." This demon induces him to go, almost aimlessly, to America. He returned to find himself feted and received with gladness by all. But hypochondria, in his own words, had planted its teeth deep in his heart, and everything was useless. And in fact this unhappy heart had an attack of pericarditis, from which it recovered only imperfectly. From that time sleep, once the only medicine for his trouble, ceased to visit him. Every night he is surrounded by terrible visions. One would say, he wrote, in a truly insane fashion, that the devil is hunting in my belly. I hear there a perpetual barking of dogs and a funeral echo of hell. Without joking, is enough to make one despair. That misanthropy which we have already noted in Heller and Swift and Cardan and Rousseau took possession of Lenau in 1840, with all the accompaniments of mania. He is afraid and ashamed of men, disgusted with them. Germany was preparing bouquets and triumphal arches in his honour, but he fled without any cause, went to and fro from one country to another. He was causelessly angry and impatient, and felt himself incapable of work. Non est firmam secubant. It seemed, as he himself said, at the same time his appetite became as insane as his brain. He returned with a strange taste to the mysticism of his childhood, wished to study the Gnostics, and read over again the stories of sorcerers which he had found so attractive in his youth, while he drank coffee enormously and smoked excessively. It was incredible, he observed, how in moving his body, in lighting or changing a cigar, new ideas arose within him. He wrote during entire nights, wandered, journeyed, meditated a marriage, projected great works, and executed none. It was the last flickering of a great spirit. In 1844, Lenau complained more and more of headache, of constant perspiration, of extreme weakness. His left hand and the muscles of the eyes and cheeks were paralyzed, and began to write with orthographic errors and quibbles. As we gut es mir gut, for mir get, or I am not delirious but lyrical. Suddenly on the 12th of October he had a violent attack of suicidal mania. He was restrained and furiously struck and broke everything, burning his manuscripts. Gradually he became composed and intelligent again, and even analyzed his attack minutely in that terrible chaotic poem, the Tromgemwellen. It was a ray of sunlight in the dark night. It was, as Schelling well said, genius for the last time dominating insanity. In fact, his condition was constantly getting worse. Another suicidal attack was followed by that fatal comfort, that pleasant excitement which marks the concealment of general paralysis. I enjoy life, he said. I am glad that the terrible visions of old have been succeeded by pleasant and delightful visions. He imagined that he was in Walhalla with Goethe, and that he had become king of Hungary, and was victorious in battle. He made puns on his family name, Nimsch. In 1845 he lost his sense of smell, which had previously been very delicate, and ceased to care for violets, his favourite flowers. He no longer recognized his old friends, notwithstanding this sad condition. He was still able to write a lyric marked by extravagant mysticism, but not without the old beauty. One day he conducted to Plato's bust. He said, "There is the man who invented stupid love." Another time, hearing someone say, "He leaves the great Lenau," the unfortunate man replied, "Now Lenau has become very, very small," and we wept for a long time. Lenau is unhappy, were his last words. He died on the 21st of August, 1850. The autopsy only revealed a little serum in the ventricles and traces of progressive pericarditis. In this same asylum at Döbling died some years later another great man, Széchenyi, the creator of Danubian navigation, the founder of the Magyar Academy, the promoter of the Revolution of 1848. At the very apogee of the Revolution, when Széchenyi was a minister, he was heard one day begging Kossuth, one of his colleagues in the ministry, not to let him be hanged. It was looked upon as a joke, but it was not so. He foresaw the misfortunes which would fall on his country, and wrongly judged himself responsible. The monomania of persecution took possession of him and threatened to lead him to suicide. He gradually became calm, but exhibited morbid loquacity, strange in a diplomatist and a conspirator, and all day long he would stop the lunatics and idiots, and what was worse, the enemies of his country whom he met in prison, and narrate to them the long confession of his imaginary sins. In 1850 an old passion for chess awoke in him and took an insane character. It became necessary to pay a poor student to ply with him for 10 or 12 hours at a time. The unfortunate student went mad, but Széchenyi slowly became sane. At the same time began to lose an aversion for contact with human beings which had taken possession of him, and which made it impossible for him to even see his relations. There only remained of his morbid habits a certain repugnance to the bright country light, and a great objection to leave his room. On certain days of the month he considered to receive his much-loved children. With a gesture he led them tenderly to his table, and read what he had written, but it required much diplomacy to bring him out into the park. His intelligence remained clear. It was even more robust than ever. He kept himself acquainted with the whole German and Magyar literary movement, and he watched for the smallest sign of better fortune to come to his country. When he saw an Austrian intrigue hindering the completion of the Eastern Railway, to which he had devoted himself so vigorously, he wrote a letter to Zichy, in which he showed all his old power, as may be seen from the following passages. What has existed once often reappears in the world under another form and different conditions. A broken bottle cannot be put together, yet those poor fragments of glass are not lost. They may be thrown into the furnace and become a vessel for Tokay, the king of wines, to sparkle in. While the broken bottle may have held but a very inferior wine, the greatest praise can be given to a Hungarian is to tell him that he has stood firm. You know, my friend, our old proverb, stand firm even in the mire. Let us apply that motto. Distrust the reproaches even of our brothers to serve the common cause. To remain at one's post, in spite of the mud that fanatical or frivolous patriots throw in the faces of their brothers and companions in arms. To remain obstinately there, even when insult strikes one in the face. That should be the mot d'ordre of the present time. In 1858, when the Austrian ministry exerted pressure on the Hungarian Academy to abolish the articles of its statutes, which constituted the culture of the Magyar language, its fundamental task, Széchenyi wrote another letter, which describes his mental condition. Can I be silent when I see that noble seed crushed? Can I forget the services which that powerful benefactor has rendered us? I ask, I whose misfortune lies not in a vague confusion of ideas, but on the contrary in the fatal gift of seeing too clearly, too distinctly, to make any illusion possible. Ought I not to raise a cry of alarm, seeing our dynasty possessed by I know not what evil influence, fighting against the most energetic of its peoples, against that for whom the future reserves the highest dignity, and not only contempting it, but stifling it, depriving it of its proper character, shaking to its roots the secular tree of the empire. Founder of this academy, it is my duty today to speak, as long as my head is on my shoulders, as long as my brain is not entirely obscured, as long as the light of my eyes remains unveiled by eternal night. I shall retain my right to decide concerning the rules. Our emperor will sooner or later understand that the assimilation of the races of the empire is merely the utopia of his ministers. The day will come when all will detach themselves. Hungary alone, which has no racial affinity with the other European nations, will seek to accomplish its own destiny beneath the aegis of the royal dynasty. That was in 1858. In 1859, even before the outbreak of war, he prophesied defeat and showed its results. There are crises, he said, which lead to cure when the sick person is not incurable. He published at London a book in which, in a strange and humorous, but at the same time terrible way, he traced the history of Hungary's sufferings under Bach's iron rule, sketched the future of his country, and counselled a policy of concord, parallel but not servile to that of Austria. In truth, he wrote himself, this book is miserable. But do you know how the Margaret Island was formed? According to an old legend, the Danube once occupied its site. Some carrion once, no one knows how, settled on to a sandbank and became attached there. Whatever the river swept down, froth, leaves, branches, trees, all were piled up there, and at last a magnificent island arose. My work is something like that carrion. Who knows what may arise out of it at last? A few months later, Hübner succeeded Bach, and the liberal system was inaugurated. Széchenyi was wild with joy. From his humble room he encouraged the minister, sent him plans of reform, inspired and wrote papers on the renewal of Austria, not forgetting Hungary. The dream was soon dissipated. Hübner was succeeded by Thierry, a bad disciple of Bach, armed with the old and superannuated system of Austria. All reform was abandoned. This unfortunate Széchenyi resisted sorrowfully. He called Reichberg, begged him to inform the emperor of his mistake, and while there was still time, and submitted programs for an Austrian constitution and a Hungarian constitution. Internal affairs to be treated separately and external affairs conjointly. Reichberg, far less foreseeing than this inspired madman, said, shaking his head, one can easily see that this project comes from a lunatic asylum. Worse still, Thierry, suspecting a vulgar conspirator in the great Magyar, sent a troop of police to visit the asylum, threatened to imprison him, and deprived him of his papers. The unhappy man, whose madness was merely an irresistible need to serve his country at all costs, had only one remorse. He feared he had not sufficiently served his country, and henceforth all hopes were closed. He sought in vain to stifle his poignant grief by playing desperately at chess. At last he shot himself with a revolver. That was on the 8th of April 1860. In 1867, Francis Joseph was crowned King of Hungary, thus realizing the dreams of the doubling lunatic, and Reichberg, who had laughed at them, was called upon to put them in practice. E.T.A. Hoffmann, the strange poet, artist, and musician, whose drawings ended in caricature, his tales an extravagance, and his music a mere medley of sound, but who was nevertheless the real creator of fantastic poetry, was a drunkard. Many years before his death he wrote in his journal, "Hours at that, awake or sleep, my thoughts are always running, in spite of myself, on this miserable theme of madness. Disorderly ideas seem to rise out of my mind like blood from open veins." He was so sensitive to atmospheric variations that he constructed a meteorological scale out of his subjective emotions. For many years he was subjected to a real monomania of persecution, with hallucinations of which the fantasies of his stories were converted into realities. The famous Sicilian physiologist Fodera often declared that he could furnish bread for 200,000 men with a single oven of very simple construction, and that with 40 soldiers he could overcome any army, even 1,000,000 strong. When about 50 years of age he fell violently in love with a girl who lived opposite him. One fine day, being in the street, he gazed up rapturously at the charming maiden, who, to free herself from her wearisome adorer, emptied a vessel of dirty water on his head. Fedora, however, regarded this as a manifestation of love, and returned home full of joy. In the courtyard he saw a fowl, which, as he declared, had an extraordinary resemblance to the beloved maiden. He immediately brought it, covered it with kisses, allowed the precious creature to do anything, to soil his books and his clothes, and even to perch on his bed. The most complete type of madness and genius is presented to us by Schopenhauer. He himself considered that he inherited his intelligence from his mother, a literary woman full of vivacity, but heartless, while his character came from his father, a banker, who was misanthropic and eccentric to monomania. From childhood his hearing was defective, and he believed, and it is probably true, that he inherited his deafness, his very large head, and his brilliant eyes from his father. He lived for some time in England, under the care of a clergyman. He learnt to know the English language and literature, and also learned to despise the bigotry of his hosts. Notwithstanding constant change of scene involved in his travels, he was never cheerful, and gave free course in his discontent with himself and his surroundings. "From my youth," he says, "I have always been melancholy. Once, when I was perhaps 18, I thought to myself, in spite of my youth, that the world would not be the work of God, but rather of a devil. During my education I certainly had to suffer too much from my father's temperament. He was frightened by imaginary diseases. In Switzerland the Alps aroused in him sadness rather than admiration. His mother, like all those who came in contact with him, experienced the unhappy effects of his character, for when in 1807 he wished at the age of 19 to come to see her at Weimar, she wrote to him, "I have always told you that it would be very difficult for me to live with you. The more nearly I observe you, the more this difficulty increases, so far at least as I am concerned. I do not hide from you that, as long as you remain what you are now, I would support any sacrifice rather than submit to it. I do not misunderstand the foundation of goodness in you. What separates me from you is not your heart, not your inner, but your outer self, your views, your judgments, your manner of behaving. In short, I cannot harmonize with you in anything that concerns your external self. Even your ill humour, your lamentations over the inevitable, your sombre face, your extravagant opinions, which you give forth like oracles, and tolerate no opposition to, oppress me, shock me serenity, and are no use to yourself. Your disagreeable discussions, your lamentations over the stupidity of the world and human misery, give me wretched nights and bad dreams." He became more and more estranged from his mother, alleging that she had not respected his father's memory, that she had dissipated the common fortune by her extravagance, and had thus reduced him to the necessity of working for his living. This effort was entirely repugnant to his nature. In this he yielded to a feeling of anguish, which by his own confession bordered on madness. "If there is nothing to cause me misery, I am tormented by the thought that there must be something hidden from me. Misera condito nostra." In 1814 Schopenhauer left Weimar to complete his great work. He was convinced that he could, and must, open a new and only way to lead men of mind and heart to truth. He felt in himself something more than mere science, something demoniacal, demonisches. In 1813 he had already said, "Beneath my hand, and still more in my head, a work of philosophy is ripening, which will be at once an ethic and metaphysic, hitherto so unreasonably separated, just as man has been divided into body and soul. The work grows and gradually becomes concrete, like the fetus in its mother's womb. I do not know what will appear at last. I recognize a member, an organ, one part after another. I write without seeking for results, for I know that it all stands on the same foundation, and will thus compose a vital and organic whole. I do not understand the system of the work, just as a mother does not understand the fetus that develops in her bowels, but she feels it tremble within her. My mind draws its food from the world by the medium of intelligence and thought. The astonishment it gives body to my work, yet I do not know why it should happen in me and not in others who receive the same food. O chance, sovereign of this world, let me live in peace for a few years yet, for I love my work as a mother loves her child. When it is ripe and brought into the light, then exercise your rights, and claim interest for the delay. But if in this iron century I succumb before that hour, may these unripened principles and studies be received by the world as they are, until perhaps some related mind appears who will collect and unite the members. All the characteristic symptoms of the various steps that lead up to insanity, the rapid passage from profound grief to excessive joy, may be found in Schopenhauer. In a moment of tranquil reflection on himself, in 1814, after having found that men were a soup of bread dipped in water with little arsenic, and after having declared that their egoism is like that which binds a dog to his master, he wrote, "And now do not accept yourself, examine your loves and your friendships. Observe if your objective judgments are not in great part subjective and impure." And another page, just as the most beautiful body contains within it facial and metaphysic gases, so the noblest character offers traits of badness, and the greatest genius presents traces of pettiness and excessive pride. The same alternations may be found throughout his life. Sometimes a keen and contemptuous critic, he shows haughty presumption. Other times he descends to the lowest literary platitudes. Sometimes he wandered about the delightful suburbs of Dresden, lost in the contemplation of nature. Other times he wallowed in prosaic love adventures, from which distinguished friends were obliged to save him, and this while he was elaborating his great work, Die Welt als well an Wurzelung, which was to astonish the world. He thus, remarks von Selditz, give the example of a mania perperii spiritualis, such as sometimes takes possession of pregnant women. Schopenhauer himself told Frauenstedt that at the time when he was writing his great work he must have been very strange in his person and behaviour, as people took him for a madman. One day when he was walking in a conservatory at Dresden, and while contemplating the plants, talked aloud to himself and gesticulated. An attendant came up and asked him who he was. "You can tell me who I am," replied Schopenhauer. "I shall be very much obliged to you." And he walked away, leaving the astonished attendant fully persuaded that he was a lunatic. With such a disposition, it is not surprising that Schopenhauer, like many prophets, believed that he was impelled by a demonal spirit. When my intelligence has touched its apogee, and was under favourable conditions, at its point of greatest tension, he was capable of embracing anything. He could suddenly bring forth revelations and give birth to chains of thought well worthy of preservation. In 1816 he wrote, "It happens to me among men, as to Jesus of Nazareth, when he had to awake his disciples always asleep. Even in old age he spoke of his great work in such a way as to exclude all doubt as to the inspiration which had produced it, such a work only being possible under the influence of inspiration. At that age he gazed with astonishment at his work, especially at the fourth book, as at a work written by some other person. It is worth recalling here the doubling of personality so common in men of genius. After he had handed his book over to the publisher, he set off readily, without awaiting its publication, with a proud faith that he had given a revelation to the world. His délire des grandeurs at this period increased, and the mental disturbance he underwent revealed itself later. He wrote, "In enchanting Venice, love's arms held me long and fettered, until an inner voice bade me break free and lead my steps elsewhere." And again, "If I could only satisfy my desire to look upon this race of toads and vipers as my equals, it would be a consolation to me." While oscillating between mental exaltation and depression, he heard of the collapse of his banking house. It is easy to understand the grief which this news caused him. He was reduced to the necessity of living by philosophy, instead of for philosophy, as he had desired to do. He twice sought to become a Privatdozent in Berlin, but he was unsuccessful in these attempts. His violent attacks on his contemporaries displeased his hearers, and his passionate disputations and his tendency in holding strange opinions, which he gave forth as oracles, rendered precarious his relations with friends and men of learning. The invasion of cholera at the beginning of 1831 completed his troubles. On the last night of 1830 he had already had a dream, which he looked upon as a prophecy foretelling his death in the new year. This dream, he wrote in his Cogitata, influenced me to my departure from Berlin immediately the cholera began in 1831. I had scarcely reached Frankfurt on the Main when I had a very distinct vision of spirits. They were, as I think, my ancestors, and announced to me that I should survive my mother, at that time still living. My father, who was dead, carried a light in his hand. That this hallucination was accompanied by a real brain affection is proved by the fact that at the time he fell into deep melancholy, not speaking to any one for weeks altogether. The doctors were alarmed, and induced him to go to Mannheim for change of scene. More than a year later he returned to Frankfurt. When the acute period of his illness had apparently passed, signs of it remained, however, in his peculiar bearing. His habit of gesticulating and talking aloud to himself as he walked through the streets of the city, or sat at table in the restaurant, and in his fury against such philosophisters as Hegel, Schleiermacher, and similar charlatans, who shine like so many stars in the firmament of philosophy, and rule the philosophic market. He accused him of depriving him of the praise and fame he deserved, by deliberately keeping silence concerning his work. This was a fixed idea with him, like the idea of his own infallibility, even after he seemed to return to a relatively normal condition, thanks to the fame which, after a delay of 30 years, at length crowned his name and his works. His délire des grandeurs, his melancholy accompanied by morbid rage, born of the idea of persecution, had really shown themselves in him from childhood. At 6 years of age he believed that his parents wished to abandon him. At student he was always morose. One of the things that caused him most trouble was noise, especially when produced by the whips of drivers. To be sensitive to noise, he wrote, is one of the numerous misfortunes which discount the privilege of genius. Que non habet indignationem, he wrote, non habet ingenium. But his indignation was excessive, a morbid rage. One day, when his landlady was chattering in the anteroom, he came out and shook her so violently that he broke her arm, and was fined for damages. He was generally hypochondriacal. He was driven from Naples by the fear of smallpox, from Verona by the idea that he had been poisoned by snuff, from Berlin by the dread of cholera, and previously by the conscription. In 1831 he had a fresh attack of restlessness. At the least sound in the street he put his hand to his sword, his fear becoming real suffering. He could not open a letter without suspecting some great misfortune. He would not shave his beard, but burnt it. He hated women and Jews and philosophers, especially philosophers, and loved dogs, remembering them in his will. He reasoned about everything, however unimportant, about his great appetite, about the moonlight, which suggested quite illogical ideas to him, etc. He believed in table turning, and that magnetism could heal his dog's paws and restore his own hearing. One night the servant dreamt that she had to wipe some ink stains. In the morning he spilled some, and the great philosopher deduced that everything happens necessarily. He was contradiction personified. He placed annihilation, nirvana, as the final aim of life, and predicted, which means that he desired, 100 years of life. He preached sexual abstinence as a duty, but did not himself practice it. He who had suffered so much from the intolerance of others insulted Mareschot and Buckner, and rejoiced when the government deprived them of the professional chairs. He lived on the first story in case of fire, would not trust himself to his hairdresser, hid gold in the ink-pot, and letters of change beneath the bedclothes. When I have no troubles, he said, like Rousseau, is in that I am most afraid. He feared to touch a razor. A glass that was not his own might communicate some disease. He wrote business documents in Greek called Latin or Sanskrit, and disseminated them in books to prevent unforeseen and impossible curiosity, which would have been much easier to avoid by a simple lock and key. Though he regarded himself as the victim of a vast conspiracy of professors of philosophy concerted at Gotha to preserve silence concerning his books, he yet dreaded lest they should speak of them. I would rather that worms should gnaw my body than that professors should gnaw my philosophy. Lacking all affection, he even insulted his mother, and drew from her example conclusions against the whole female sex, long of hair and short of sense. Yet while despising monogamy, he recommended tetragamy, to which he saw but one objection, the 4 mothers-in-law. The same lack of affection made him despise patriotism. The passion of fools, the most foolish of passions. He took part with the soldiers against the people, and to the former and to his dog he left his property. He was always preoccupied with himself, not only with the self that was created of a new system, but in hundreds of his letters he speaks with strange complaisance of his photograph, of his portrait in oils, and of a person who had bought it in order to place it in a kind of chapel, like the image of a saint. No one has, for the rest, maintained more openly than Schopenhauer the relationship of genius to insanity. People of genius, he wrote, are not only unpleasant in practical life, but weak in moral sense and wicked. And elsewhere such men can have but few friends. Solitude reigns on the summits. Genius is closer to madness than to ordinary intelligence. The lives of men of genius show how often, like lunatics, they are in a state of continual agitation. Nikolai Vasilievich Gogol, born 1809, after suffering from an unhappy love affair, gave himself up for many years to unrestrained onanism. He became eventually a great novelist. Having known Pushkin, he was attracted to the short story. Then he fell under the influence of the Moscow school and became a humorist of the highest order. In his Dead Souls he satirizes the Russian bureaucracy with so much vis comica as to show the need of putting an end to a form of government which is a martyrdom both for the victims and the executioners. On the publication of his historical Cossack romance, Taras Bulba, he reached the summit of his fame. His admirers compared him to Homer. Even the government patronized him. Then a new idea began to dominate him. He thought that he painted his country with so much crudity and realism that the picture might incite to a revolution which would not be kept within reasonable limits, and might overturn society, religion, and the family, leaving him the remorse of having provoked it. This idea took possession of his mind and dominated it, as it had formerly been dominated by love, by the drama, and by the novel. He then sought by his writings to combat Western liberalism, but the antidote attracted fewer readers than the poison. Then he abandoned work, shut himself up in his house, giving himself up to prayer to the saints, and supplicating them to obtain God's pardon for his revolutionary sins. He accomplished a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, from which he returned somewhat consoled, when the revolution of 1848 broke out, and his remorse was again aroused. He was constantly pursued by visions of the triumph of nihilism, and in his alarm he called on Holy Russia to overthrow the pagan West, and to found on its ruins the orthodox Pan-Slavist Empire. In 1852 the great novelist was found dead in Moscow of exhaustion, or rather of tabes dorsalis, in front of the shrine before which he was accustomed to lie for days in silent prayer. End of Chapter 4. End of Part 1 of The Man of Genius by Cesare Lombroso, and end of Section 4.